So on to the kind of second segment of today's event, which is the roundtable discussion. As I mentioned earlier, it's not round, but it's a table, and we're sitting around it so we can discuss. Now, online delegates, can you hear me speak loud and clear? Is it coming through?
Yeah.
Yes, excellent. Right. So we've got an hour thereabouts. So the theme of today's roundtable discussion, which came about largely as a result of an event that we ran at the was it not the Museum of Liverpool, the Maritime Museum. So Jeanette and Heather kind of did a presentation, and I knew Jonathan previously, and I just thought the theme of art emerged really quite powerfully. So what we can do, if we kind of initially just start by introducing ourselves very, very briefly. So I'll orchestrate that in a second. And then we've kind of preset 3 questions, which I'll kind of facilitate the 3 of you speaking around that. And then again, same format, if we kind of we aim to leave about 10 minutes at the end for kind of questions, comment, discussion. And I've also set up a Padlet, hopefully that's circulated for online delegates, so they can pause. It doesn't have to only be questions, it might be comments, thoughts, kind of contributions that you want to leave with us to think about, etc. So my glamorous assistant Mike has kind of volunteered to navigate that. So yeah, I suppose I should have done this initially, but my name's Craig Hammond. I assume you all know me. So I'm a reader in pedagogies of critical theory, and I'm going to be chairing today's event. So the people are far more interested in you than they are in me. So Jeanette, would you like to go first?
Hi everyone, nice to see everyone here. Thank you so much for the invitation to sit beside some amazing members of staff as well here inside the university and beyond. So yes, Jeanette Porter, I'm a lecturer in education here at John Moores University. I've made some notes, I will try to read them, but I will ramble, I do apologise. So I've worked in and around the university for over 20 years, and something the glamorous assistant behind me commented on it because we fell into academia. And I feel as though that's very much what happened to me. So maybe 20 years ago, I was artist working on a research project in the north of the city, evaluating what young people knew about culture. Anyway, as a result of that, some visiting lecturing, research assistant, project officer, etc., etc. And now I'm a lecturer in education. Outside of that, I'm also an artist. I work in communities. I've worked across the UK, Africa, Sweden, Norway, trying to remember some more. Diverse communities from take Liverpool to the clan men and women of the Barnes upon Humber Society in Lincolnshire. Not going to miss them out at all in this lecture today. I also sit on our University Ethics and Research Committee. I'm proud to do that since 2019. And I brought this along to talk about OT.
Jonathan? Yeah.
I'm Jonathan Kearney. I don't work here. I'm an artist, and I'm a course student for Masters in Fine Arts at Central St Martin's, which is a large art school in London. But I'm a PhD student here. So I work part-time as a teacher and part-time as an artist, and there's kind of questions around what art means and the relationship of art and education. And 2 quick thoughts just to throw in, just to kind of tease, kind of make provoke a little bit, is art is often, not always, but often at the edges. It's very rarely at the centre of culture and society, broadly, often the centre of culture, but not in society as a whole. And that kind of on the edge, that margin space is an interesting space to be educationally as well as artistically. It's a place from which infiltration can happen sometimes. And if the questions we're thinking about around activism is an interesting space to think that to act against something or in spite of the power that's there, then being on the margins could often be quite useful. The second thought around art is that often there's a lot of ambiguity about it. And so encourage the idea that artists develop a comfort with ambiguity. And I think that's a positive and valuable thing. And I'm quite glad that not everybody in society is comfortable with ambiguity. I'm quite glad that some people are very confident about procedures and protocols that they need to follow. If I break my leg, I'm glad that they follow certain procedures. But I'm also glad that there are spaces for people to be comfortable with ambiguity, and art can often help that. That bringing that into an education space is really intriguing. So although I work at Centre for Smartest, which is measure these things in different ways, I really don't care about that kind of stuff, but it's often seen kind of the centre of the art world in terms of fine arts education. I'm actually very much on the margins of that. This is my 21st year teaching online. And that in itself kind of pushes everything that I do very much to the margins and the edges of what education might mean to higher education. It raises lots of questions. How is that even possible? And that in itself becomes an interesting space of ambiguity, an interesting space of margins and pushing against.
Excellent, thanks. Heather.
Hey, my name's Heather Hatton and I work here at John Moores University. I work in the teacher education department and the specialism is secondary history. Prior to this, I was a secondary history teacher. I've also got a PhD in urban history as well. So my kind of real motivation for being here today is kind of what was already mentioned before, in terms of thinking how student teachers can be agents of change and working against the kind of constraints which we find ourselves in the world of education.
Excellent, thanks. So we've kind of obviously discussed before, so we've come up with 3 questions that will hopefully tease out some kind of interesting and kind of collaborative ideas as well. So the first question, which is I think one of the main themes for us to engage in today, is the kind of the problematization of the notion of academic activism. So that brings us to the first question. To what extent is the notion of academic activism useful for you kind of thinking about an approach in your work and practice? And I suppose that can be both teaching and art or both. So who wants to kind of leap in first? Whatever that is.
Yes, that's okay. So 30 years ago, I graduated locally with a degree in fine art and embarked on a career as an artist. Successful, receiving grants constantly. I was working in the Greater Merseyside area and then spread across the country. I mentioned Hayes, Food Code, and where that led me to was about £150,000 funded project through the European Agriculture and Government Guarantee Fund, supported by MAD. And I'm an artist at this point. I'm not an academic. I'm an artist at this point. I'm presenting at conferences, voted the best project sponsored by MAD across the country and getting more funds. It did clash with having babies at the time as well, so that was a bit problematic. So I've always applied for funds to deliver projects to work in communities. Now, when I started to merge into a conversation with academia, the relationship about being the artist in communities, whereas the academic artist working within communities, there was a little bit of friction. There was some questions and conversations because there's a structure within academia that doesn't exist when we're individually working as artists within communities. There is different constraints, and one of those is ethics, and we will come on to that as a second question. So I think for me, I found myself a little frustrated because I had very creative, very broad ideas about how I wanted to engage with the communities that I was working with. But during that time, I had to work under the guidelines of what is ethical within our university. So there was this constant dialogue of what do I normally do? How do I normally deliver? How do I normally give an opportunity for the voice of a person to be part of this wider community project? Whilst turning that upside down, the academic is looking at that as the participants, and the data that is produced was a very different conversation. So as an academic now, I am having questions regarding engagement with communities with kind of almost a different hat on, but keeping the artist hat very firmly held in one hand. I'll hand over to my colleagues.
So yeah, when I got given these questions by Craig to think about, I was actually away in Chicago, and I was thinking about how I was going to present in this conference, and I actually came across a statue of Abraham Lincoln, and this was around about the time of Indigenous Peoples Day, and I don't know if people know much about that, but it causes quite a lot of controversy in the States whether it should be known as that. And anyway, this particular statue of Lincoln, and Lincoln's seen as a great hero by a lot of people in the United States, obviously bringing the nation back together after the Civil War, and obviously he is assassinated. But this statue, in my mind, has been kind of, or it was, have been artistically kind of reimagined. So there was blood stain or red paint, I guess to symbolise blood all over the statue, and also the slogan had been written, Lincoln was an executioner, and we want our land back to Ireland, etc., etc. So this kind of got me thinking, and I read some news articles, and lots of news articles talked about how this was a really big tragedy. It was vandalism. Obviously, the statue had been defaced, the great hero of America had been defaced, but this was an alternative vision, I guess, an alternative perspective from Indigenous people, trying to draw attention to the fact that, Abraham Lincoln had it's another narrative, really, isn't it? It's that he was, really instrumental in the forced removal of a lot of Indigenous people, and really quite a figure who's not remembered well by Indigenous people. So thinking about that, and thinking about, kind of my role in IT and how teachers can be agents of change. Really what I try and do in my day-to-day practice when I'm teaching the student teachers is I really kind of get them to think critically about what they're teaching, how they're teaching, and why they're teaching. So, getting them to try and understand how they can be agents of change, and how they can include particular topics in the history classroom, because as already mentioned, we have quite a rigid curriculum. And there's lots of measures imposed by the DfE in terms of what needs to be covered in schools, and there's a real kind of big focus on knowledge in history at the moment, whereas I don't really believe history is about factual recall and knowledge, but it is more about disciplinary skills. Anyway, so I really get my student teachers to kind of think about how they can teach alternative perspectives in the classroom. So I get them thinking about how they might go about teaching environmental history and climate change. I get them thinking about how they can incorporate diverse voices within the history curriculum, and making sure that they're embedded and not just tagged on in Black History Month, for example. So making sure that there is this real kind of conscious effort to have a multitude of voices within the curriculum to be representative of the multicultural world that we are in today. I take these various historical sites in Liverpool, and I take them to the Slavery Museum, and I get them thinking about how we can teach histories of Black history beyond slavery, how we can think about pre-colonial African history and not just looted treasures. So take them to the World Museum and look at the mean bronzes and everything. And I've really problematized what has been traditional in the school curriculums, and get them to think about how they can include those alternative perspectives within the classroom because for me, I guess history is about broadening horizons and getting people to think differently. So that's how I go about it.
Excellent. Great examples there. Fabulous. Jonathan.
So I'll simply phrase academic activism. I'm going to give a couple of examples of the context from where I teach, and it's a little bit risky because one of my students is here in the online space with us. So you're welcome to check with her and whether it's actually true or not. Ironically, I think sometimes the biggest act of academic activism is actually against the academic structures that exist over us. And I can picture it as kind of like almost like in layers. We have the kind of the academic institution and all the structures and some of the stuff we've already talked about today that sit above. And students come underneath that. And I think that we use that language underneath. And often the only phrase I can really come up with is that their imaginations are hijacked by that academic institutional way of thinking. So therefore, and I think a couple of you have mentioned already in discussion about how they, if you go off subject, it's uncomfortable because I need to know this for, what is it that they need to know it for? It's because we've set up these structures. So I see almost in a way the biggest place for academic activism is actually in the bit in between. Because often if we try to challenge the academic institution structure from above, and that's a challenge in itself, that's an activism in that direction. But sometimes I find that, and not all by any means, but sometimes some students are also resistant to that, to anything which is different, anything which is pushing at those boundaries. And therefore we're kind of in the middle almost between those things. So a couple of things that we've done, but these aren't really practical things in a way, they're kind of theoretical, but they kind of work out in practice. And just a bunch of, there could be a bunch of other things as well. And it echoes a little bit what Mike's already talked about in terms of hope, but in particular, the concept around compassionate pedagogy. Some of you may come across that, and there's a whole kind of network in the UK, internationally, but particularly in the UK, that thinks a lot about that. So what we try to do on the course that I'm the course leader for is have compassion and kindness as the roots of what we do. That you generate that's the space in which we are together. And in that space, I see that as an activism, an act against power structures that might push us in another direction. So that's the first state and a first idea. And then one other one is the actual art process itself. So the art process itself is a really interesting thing because if you try to make a great work of art, I can guarantee one thing will fail. If you concentrate on process, then something good may come out of it at the end. But it's a not focus on that end product. And that in itself is a kind of a really interesting shift. Now we talk about that pedagogically in terms of the course and encouraging people to understand that, to see that within their art practice. I think there's something really interesting in the bigger picture of that. But if we put process as absolutely vital, as centre to anything that's going on, then that in itself acts like a form of academic activism against the kind of controlling forces. And therefore the hijacked imaginations are then freed to become something else, to imagine other things, other possibilities. So I guess if activism is pushing against that sense of some kind of controlling structures, that is breaking that's maybe too strong a word. It's in the cracks. It's making little spaces where life and other things can grow instead.
Excellent. That definitely chimes. I think it chimes with Mike's keynote, and it certainly chimes with my work as well. Because often the kind of the gauntlet that I throw down, so to speak, is a kind of challenge to colleagues. Because it's very easy to fall into the trap of kind of blaming the university, the system, the structures, the government. Whereas, fractals, cracks, fissures, I think our, once those doors close, but when we all in our environment as teachers or facilitators or collaborators, I think we should kind of remind ourselves to be challenged as activists, to look at the space where we can still bring difference and change and hope, positivity. So on that theme, on to the second question. So picking up on this notion of activism, so how do you engage in your respective communities? That might be teaching communities, it might be art communities, and specifically in relation to the notion of ethics. So how do you navigate ethics in relation to being an activist in that sense?
That's on the ethics committee.
Sounds like it defaults to you first.
Okay, fair enough. So I really enjoy being an ethics committee. I really enjoy unpicking what that actually means for the university. I think for me, putting myself on that committee was for me to understand how the participants in research could be fully respected as agents of change, as activists, and from my perspective, as artists, as activists as well. So I came across the Ethics Committee because I was applying for ethics to work on a relationship education project across Greater Merseyside schools, 30 schools, about 500 plus young people, basically talking about gender-based violence and looking at what constitutes healthy and unhealthy relationships. The ethics application process can be arduous. It's there to safeguard the participants, it's there to safeguard the university. But in that process, those participants are my family, they're our family members, they're potentially our students, our siblings, and they have not only a voice, they have a story to share. And it's how do you capture that sitting comfortably under the umbrella of the Ethics Committee for me was really key, because I struggled with the idea that the participant was, in a sense, dehumanised because we were referring to them as participant and not as, we'll call that person Barbara, for example. Where is Barbara's voice in this rich data that is produced? So that's why I stumbled across the Ethics Committee. But I think it's only fair to talk about what is before us in terms of looking at ethics and working within communities. Well, we're looking at process of developing, sewing together an oversized sleeping bag. The idea came from an artisanship project that a director called Grassroots, and the idea came about a crash performance at St George's Hall celebrating the city of Liverpool and what the city of Liverpool has to offer. And I thought, well, this is a perfect way to remember an artist at this point, and my funding is from the arts at this point. Perfect way to demonstrate that our city has a real crisis of homelessness. So I was working with speakers, those with addiction, those who were in hospitals, those who still had chosen homelessness as a life force, who wanted to be outside of the mainstream system. So I invited them all to bring, if they had one, a sleeping bag. And at some point during this celebration, I would ring the bell and everyone would just stop and get into their sleeping bag. And there was maybe 20 people across St George's Hall diving into a sleeping bag in absolute silence. And I thought, well, you know, what I'd like to do is draw something from that where we're a collective in a sleeping bag. And the messages that you see before you are part of that process that is involved in the members of Grassroots who want to leave a message forever on the growing sleeping bag. So if anybody, this is all about interactions. If anybody has seen something on here that they want to read out, that's absolutely fine. I did share a story with a couple of colleagues in the creation of this sleeping bag when I worked at Whitechapel some years ago. And a young man had came and he wanted to sew onto the bag, but he didn't know how to sew. I said, well, I can teach you how to thread a needle. We can work together, we can sew. He said, that's great, because my cap that I'm wearing, I damaged it in the last burglary that I've done. I want to fix this cap first, and then I will work on our bag. So we're picking up real stories of real life people who are surviving their day-to-day business. So let's throw ethics into the mix then. Let's throw academia and ethics into the mix. How do we incorporate the voice of those people in terms of sitting within the ethics framework? What is it that we as academics, as artists, need to do to make sure that the voices are heard, the stories are respected, but that material is then produced as academic data? And I appreciated what Mike said earlier about students co-writing and writing chapters of the book. And this is what this is. This is not the book. This is more than the book.
Mm-hmm.
This is more than the book.
Yeah.
I'll hand over.
Heather, you want to come in at that point in relation to activism, your community and ethics?
In terms of looking at ethics, I'm doing a project recently with my colleague who is in primary history, and we did a project on student teachers' perspectives, both in who were training to be primary teachers and secondary teachers, about what the purpose of history was. And there was this kind of real noticeable kind of tension, I guess, between what they said they thought the purpose of history was at the beginning of the course, things such as understanding different perspectives, broadening horizons, creating kind of empathy for others. All of these things shone through as what they believed the purpose of history was, and not about kind of creating national kind of pride or anything like that. They were rated very, very low. But in terms of what they're actually being allowed to do in the classroom, so I think we kind of maybe mentioned this tension already, but I'm kind of trying to get them to do all these innovative things and think creatively and challenge the curriculum. But, you know, the reality is when I find out they go into schools and they're telling me, oh, well, we've got this curriculum, it's been brought in by, I don't know, school, and we're not allowed to deviate from that. I'm not allowed to try the enrollment that you've been telling us that. I'm not allowed to do this. So there is that real tension between how we in IT can help student teachers kind of have more confidence in the sense of their own agency and what they can actually do on the day-to-day basis, and also sort of towing the line of the school and knowing that, you know, the mentor is writing a report about them and their professionalism and whether they're meeting the standards, and then they need to get a job after this as well. So all of that kind of ties in relation to what I'm trying to tell them is good history and what will be engaging for their students, how to get their students to think more critically in the classroom, and then what they're actually being allowed to do in the
Well, I think that's a good point, because it kind of it's almost a professional ethics and ethics of the self. It's okay being provocative and maybe a bit of a maverick, but are you going to get a job doing that at the end of the day? Jonathan?
I want to start with a slightly different position. So, way that a concept which I'm working with, which is kind of like it embeds kind of my approach to teaching and partly what I'm going to kind of looking at in PhD. This concept of being with, and the idea of being with is that it's not about controlling, manipulating, directing, ordering. It's simply the action of being with. I mean, on one hand, it's an artist, he's simply with the materials. So I'm that process of being with materials is actually listening very carefully to allowing that material to speak to me, so that it's telling me where it wants to go, and I'm kind of working with it, but not imposing my position or thinking or ideas on it necessarily. That's an interesting thing to then extrapolate that into an education context. What does that mean to be with students? Because presumably in some conversations we've had this, you know, I'm supposed to be the expert. I'm supposed to have all this stuff to give to them. But actually, no, I think the idea that we kind of gather around a subject together, we share that together. So that's a kind of position of being with students. And that I think in essence is an ethical position. So I'm wondering whether, for me, position of ethics and activism in an education context is not necessarily a regulatory one. There's actually one of the positionality that we take in relationship to other people, and in particular in the concept we're talking about in terms of education. So some words rather than any kind of concept, but some words that capture some of the feeling. I think hosting is a really interesting concept within education. To what does it mean to host a space? What does that feel like? What do we do? How do we consider the details that are involved in hosting? You're hosting a meal for someone. You might be very conscious about, you know, the cushions on the chair as much as the food, you know, and it's thinking about that. What does it mean to inhabit space or place? And by space and place, by the way, I don't necessarily mean physical space. Of course, that is important. It can be conceptual space, or in my case, a lot of it is online space or place. So to host, to inhabit, what does it mean to activate space, to bring energy into space? is an interesting thing. And then to bring some kind of artistic language into it is the idea of curating. So curating is that act of bringing unusual things together, juxtaposing those. And often it's not necessarily, the curator's not necessarily thinking about those two particular things. It's often the space in between, or the potential space of thought or ideas or imagination in between those two things. So what does that mean in terms of education to curate? And then finally, what does it mean to cultivate? So the idea of tending ground in which you want to see something flourish. Again, what are some of the actions, some of the feelings, the emotions in terms of an education space which is about cultivating? Just to bring in one of the concepts, which is Michel de Certeau, if you come across him, he writes a major book called Practice Everyday Life. And in that book, he talks about strategies and tactics. And strategies are the actions of the big, or the kind of the power, the authorities, the kind of structures which say this is the way things should be. Tactics are our responses to that, which are often the small actions which counter that or kind of create new possibilities and new ways. A desire path is a classic one, you know, where a pathway is being set through a park and then everyone just walks that way and creates our own desire path. That's our tactic in response to the controlling strategies, the kind of de Certeau idea. One of the things that's interesting that he talks about is that tactics fundamentally are very difficult to map. They're very difficult to gather together. Strategies are mapped, literally that's the map on which we have to function. Tactics are those little actions which are hard to map and hard to kind of gather in those kind of spaces. And I wonder whether that is the interesting thing, is that place of tactics is a place of dialogue, a place of conversation, a place of togetherness where we're kind of with each other, with the subject we're working with. And I can't put it any better. And I'm going to break your rule, Mike. I'm actually going to quote paraphrase from 1970.
Oh, no.
Just because I think this quote still rings true. He said, dialogue cannot exist in the absence of profound love, love for the world and for people. And this is the really interesting bit. Love is at the same time the foundation of dialogue and dialogue itself. And love is often a word which we don't often talk about in education, but I think that's a kind of an interesting place to put that whole thing as a fundamentally ethical position.
Excellent. So there's been a request from some of the online colleagues. So just kind of kick around a little bit, you know, what has been discussed so far. So if we just a couple of minutes just to kind of digest what we've spoken about. Give kind of online colleagues a few minutes to also have a think, digest, and maybe post some comments, contributions on the Padlet. But also, you know, for me, just to ask colleagues around here, you know, to what extent do you think this notion of academics being activists, how useful do you think it is in relation to what we've discussed, but also in relation to your own practice? To what extent do you feel like activists? Scott?
I feel like an activist, and kind of like leads into the ethics side of things. So I'm currently working on a project with the British Society of Criminology with a group of us, and it's a co-production piece. We're challenging what ethics is, especially for people with lived experience, because the ethics panels have this kind of notion that they're actually sort of qualified to make decisions for the individuals that have that lived experience. So therefore they take the autonomy of that person's voice away. So what we've done is we sort of challenged the academy and said, look, you know, how can you actually allow that to happen? What guidance do you have in place to sort of steer criminologists going forward for this sort of research? And they don't have any real kind of sort of structure of how do you use people's lived experience in an ethical way that doesn't undermine that individual or takes that power away. Because the minute you take that autonomy away and start speaking for them, you kind of really, like, you know, you're stifling their voices. And it's kind of almost arrogant in some ways of us to do that. So, you know, I think, you know, in terms of the activism that we're taking is that, you know, we've come together as a group, and we're constantly working with people with lived experience, people that are academics, all coming together under one kind of banner to basically say, right, how do we best approach this? Because I think, you know, I don't think sort of panels do enough, you know, and I'm not sort of criticising, obviously, you know, in terms of the work, but they're kind of like guided with this kind of like almost this fear response that they're kind of thinking about the protection of, you know, we've got to keep that participant safe. But have you asked that participant what makes them feel safe? You know, and I think in terms of activism, in terms of ethics, that's kind of the sort of positionality that I'd come from many of that.
I think that's really useful. It is a collective activism in that sense, and I think confronting the institutional power of something like university ethics, I think collectively that is probably the only way forward.
Yeah,
some kind of collective response in order to try to change it. Like,
yeah, and we're coming from different institutions as well, so academically and people from in practice, people with the experience that aren't in academia.
Yeah.
And we're all kind of like trying to make sure that the voices are heard and actually saying, you know, how do we do the different things together?
yeah, really simple.
I would just like to say that I'm the project lead for a project called Disabled Researchers Network. And one of the things that we're actually doing is looking at the ethics process and this idea of marginalised individuals and how they are spoken about in the ethics procedure, but also the barriers that are faced with that. So if anyone's interested in coming together with that, do reach out to me. But I wonder, in some ways, like, in terms of activism, and I think what you just said here about collective activism is really important, because I wondered whether or not it's wholly always easy to be able to identify as an academic activist when your subject or your institution see you as an outsider or too critical or too negative. And yeah, and in some ways, I think we might want to think we might be positioning students or the community, but we also have to remember the staff as well and their well-being and the dangers. And there's also another side of activism, which is that it's usually us that does a lot of work and a lot of grunt work that doesn't get really truly recognised in the systems we inhabit. So we're both too critical, but we're also the worker bees that are trying to change the system to make it better. So I kind of like, I'm quite open to this idea of how do you actually become an honest academic activist when you have all of these other barriers, because actually it means that, to use the rhetoric, Sarah Mead said it in one way, but universities now say it very differently, which is how can you actually be authentic to yourself when actually you're contained within a system that still structures and understands and sees people within certain constraints.
Yeah. Of course, you're perpetuating that system, aren't you, by working within it, reproducing it.
Yeah.
So that we've got space to do that within our classrooms, that we've got those constraints.
Yeah. And any online delegates, any comments of observation?
See if anyone's got their hand up.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just like, I really think what he was saying, Scott, about, the challenges of ethics, applications and people actually being disempowered. We're trying to protect our participants, but we're also disempowering them because by protecting them, sometimes they're not having their voice heard in the way that they want to. And I'm just like, it's just made me think, like, do we ever have like mechanisms to have people with even your potential participant being on the decision-making panel? Because, like, for me, that would be an obvious and surely doable step to say, these are my potential participants, whether they're a practitioner or a person with lived experience. Could they not therefore then sit on the decision-making panel about what they can then say about what makes them feel safe? Because I definitely, just as a side point, I'm a really young parent in prison, and I work specifically with children and families where there's a parent in prison. And I try very hard to mesh my worlds as a researcher and academic and a community worker effectively. And being an activist in the community is doable. Being an activist in research is really hard. And I'm trying to make those worlds meet somehow that's safe for everyone, and that's the crack in the middle. So I don't know. But yeah, it just seems like I don't know, like, why don't we have that solution where your potential participants are invited to contribute to the decision making?
And that's something
academic activities. Heather, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I'm often telling my student teachers, I suppose it's a little bit of a pop out, but when they get into their own actual job, then they'll be able to make these changes, and whether that's a reality, again, they're working with the constraints of the school system, I don't know, in terms of, you know, changing the curriculum, things like that. And I guess there's a larger problem, I guess, as well in not just Liverpool, but Liverpool is what we're thinking about here in terms of teacher education, but there's a real lack of diversity in terms of in teacher education, in terms of the student teachers that we're getting in, what we can do more about this. Some recent stats that I think it's only 26 black teachers in the whole of Liverpool, and it's, you know, it's a real problem, especially in terms of my discipline, getting lot of diverse backgrounds who want to become a history teacher is problematic in itself, because why would you want to teach history when you've never seen yourself within that history in school in the first place? So, you know, there's a wider problem there, and in terms of what can be done about it, I don't know really, but I think we need to kind of as a, you know, teacher education department here, we need to think more broadly about who we're kind of targeting in terms of marketing and what we can really do to show that, you know, teaching is for people of a wide variety of backgrounds and not just kind of replicating what we've already got, which is predominantly a wide teaching population. So,
Yeah, thanks. Go on, Jeanette.
We've got more things to say.
I'm completely off track. So I was thinking about a current project. I've just received some funding internally to deliver a project about diversity and inclusion. The project is called Yes, We See You, and it's in response to MenCap members of Liverpool and Sefton asking, can you see me? Yeah, I am here, I'm not invisible. And we're saying, yes, we can see you. So I'm mixed ethics application as we speak. But the idea of this project will give light to inviting MenCap members to come into our university to be represented as our students are represented on 3 mini modules: relationship education, creative writing and sport. They'll get their hoodie, they'll get their lanyard, they'll get their bags. But yes, it's great for us MenCap members to come into the university, but also I want our students, I want our staff to see that inclusion is vital to the work that we're doing on so many levels. So in a sense, it would be looking at the students that will work with me on the delivery of this Yes, We See You project. Wherever possible, I incorporate funds to employ our students through UniSense to be grassroots level learning and delivering and working within the community. Great on CV, great employability, fantastic civic engagement. But if I can make 1 ounce of difference with one of our regular students that comes through the system to get their degree, then that has impact, that has such an impact that we hope whatever their future career will be, will impact on how they work with everybody within society.
No, that's good. Jonathan.
I think the idea of constructively subverts kind of feels quite strange, and I think we've kind of hinted at the idea that activism can feel like it's kind of too powerful, too dangerous things to be involved in. And subversion has that very negative feel of kind of undermining things like that. So I looked at the etymology of it, which sometimes helpful. So sub is obviously underneath, that's from below, that makes sense. The terre, which is the Latin, if you get to stick the verb from, is to turn round, sometimes to turn upside down. Yes, it's got that kind of overthrow, overturn type feel to it as well, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be the idea that it turns something around. Or even if somebody turns something upside down, but it's supposed to be that way originally anyway. But we're so used to it that way, thinking we've turned it upside down, but actually that's the way it should be. So I'm kind of interested in the idea of it being something which is much more, the best word, quiet, gentle, rather than a kind of big aggressive activism or aggressive subversion.
think, John, you're like both should be with,
Yeah,
that's crucial, isn't it?
absolutely.
Your ethics and knowledge, learning.
Yeah.
It's a bit more existential than the formal universal aspect, ethics or knowledge. I like that, the ethics generated from the ground.
Yeah.
Rather than.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Top.
And therefore,
It's about the kiss.
yes, it is. It is.
Just feeling my top.
But not in a destructive way. I think it can be, of course it can be. But I'm interested in subversion being something which which allows us to reconstruct, to kind of rebuild, to do something different. And of course, once you've got subvert, you can have revert, and you can have divert, and so there's all kind of various little twists on it. So the idea of diverting something suggests that it's going to flow anyway, and we're not going to be able to stop that. This kind of change is not the way that we're approaching education is going to flow. But despite the blockages in the way, we can divert, so we can constructively divert or constructively subvert or something like that. So the potential is there, although it can feel like it's quite pushing and difficult. I want to hold on to hope, as Mike was talking about, that there is something different. And I'm going to finish with a quote, because it's bell books and she's worth listening to, the worth listening to. If this is about, if our imagination, student imaginations are being hijacked, then liberating that becomes really important. Now, I know she talked about liberation in a much broader context, but I think there's something in that. She says, without love, our efforts to liberate ourselves and our world community from oppression and exploitation are doomed. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others.
Oh, what to end on. Yeah, brilliant. Right, well thanks. Yeah, round of applause to all. So we're gonna end the roundtable discussion there. Now, so the Padlet is live and it will remain live, and it's not just there for online delegates either. So in the event booklet, which I think I did circulate, there's a QR code, so you can scan it and kind of put stuff in, type comments in the community form. I'm sure there's questions on the chat as well. So I think our intention as a kind of organising team is to kind of keep that live. So it's not kind of the stuff that's on there won't just be forgotten about. We'll kind of revisit that, because I think we as speakers, but also as the kind of seminar organising team, we want to kind of keep this, because it's a 3 event process, the collaborative seminar series. So we can kind of keep some of these things going. So feel free to do so. So at this point, so it's transition points again. So please get something to eat, get a drink.